The last thing I do today is talk a little bit about labor union history and the policies that impact labor unions today so we can figure out if they are a strong political force or not. So we're going to run through a little bit of labor union history here and get an idea of labor unions' role in impacting politics in the United States. So we start with the beginning of labor unions, which is basically when American economies were industrializing. So this was happening in the cities mostly, and there were all kinds of like economic and social changes, and people who were working in industrial workplaces in the cities had like no rights at all. So they started to form labor unions, and our first law here, our first policy, is that the Supreme Court ruled that labor unions are legal in 1840. So using that First Amendment, that right to association, that gives us a right to form labor unions. And so the first big labor union, the American Federation of Labor, started in 1880s and really was like a big national labor union that was able to impact politics and mostly started a long history labor union support for the Democratic Party. So the government's history with labor unions actually has been pretty dark for a long time. So in 1890s, there was a union of railway workers. So these were people working on trains and stuff, and they went on strike because of poor working conditions. And their strike crippled the entire railway system. Like trains were shut down everywhere. The country's shipping was not functional without them. So President Cleveland sent in the army to break up the strike. The strike interfered with the delivery of the mail. And in this case, the army went in to like shut down the strike and ended up killing 13 people. The leader of the strike was put in prison. Almost 60 people were hurt. So the United States very soon just started using the army against labor unions because they had the nerve to fight for workers' rights. Finally, the government took a role in protecting the labor unions under the New Deal. So, as part of New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, which created the National Labor Relations Board so that they can make sure that labor unions can collectively bargain with bosses. Also protects the rights of workers to strike. So this Wagner Act, this important law in the 1930s, guarantees the rights of people to form unions, to strike, to achieve better wages and working conditions, and creates the National Labor Relations Board to help protect and enforce the rights of labor unions. And we're going to skip ahead to the 1970s and 80s where things start to get worse for labor unions again. So there was a decline in U.S. manufacturing. Like a lot more stuff was manufactured overseas. So we needed a lot less industrial workplaces in the United States. Companies began moving their manufacturing to the South where there weren't many unions. They also started to just move their business overseas, and businesses would start to respond to labor unions, like threatening to strike or whatever, by just threatening to move the jobs to a different place. And so in the 70s and 80s, the number of strikes fell by 97%. A lot of industries were deregulated. Even though the unions fought against it, union membership continued to weaken and unions became less powerful. Then the real rock bottom moment for unions came under President Reagan. So this is in the 80s. He used to be the president of the Actors Union when he was an actor. So he seemed to be a guy that would be in favor of unions and union membership. But in 1981, the air traffic controllers in the country went on strike. So that really shut down air travel because we didn't have air traffic controllers. Reagan ordered them to end the strike because we needed air travel. And when they continued to fight for their, improved wages and working conditions, President Reagan fired all 13,000 air traffic controllers. So everyone who was on strike just lost their job and there were no air traffic controllers. Took forever to restaff those positions, but this really changed the relationship between management and unions ever since. So the 70s and 80s saw a decline in union membership and a real rock bottom blow for the power of unions to improve the rights of workers. So let's take a look at where labor unions stand today. Today, labor unions do represent almost 15 million workers across the country. That's almost 10% of all workers belong to some kind of union that fights for their rights. Workers are more likely to be in a union if they work in the public sector. So we're talking about people that work for the government in some way. So these unions are like police unions and firefighter unions, teachers unions, like Shelby County Schools. Those people work for the public sector. They work for the state. Private sector workers have way less union membership than ever. So we're at 7% of all workers in the private sector belong to a union. Union workers today are older than your average worker. They are disproportionately men, and they are mostly like centered in the Northeast and Midwest. That's where unions had been the strongest. Union workers, on average, make much higher wages, 10 to 20% higher than non-union workers. And so union membership still brings its benefits. It's just that fewer and fewer people are a part of labor unions. The biggest, most important unions in politics today are what we call umbrella unions. So, like the AFL-CIO is an example of an umbrella union because what that means is it is a big union that's made up, it like covers lots and lots and lots of little unions spread across the country. So, like if you were in a union, a part of a union at your workplace locally, your union would be a member of the AFL-CIO. And so the AFL tends to like support Democrats more than Republicans, but like we said, it's an interest group. Like they don't care who does what's best for workers as long as somebody does what's best for workers. And so they spend their time advocating for worker policies, improved working conditions, improved wages with the lawmakers in the United States government. And finally, today we'll take a quick look at some policies that we need to know about labor unions. So these are the main policy fights that labor unions are participating in across the United States. The first of these is an old one called a closed shop. Closed shop means that businesses are only allowed to hire people that are already a part of the union. So like if you are a worker that wants to work in a particular field, you need to join the union first. Places with closed shops, that means that unions are incredibly strong because even the potential employees have to be a part of the union in order to get jobs. So in this case, the union has such power that they are able to force the employer to fire anybody who gets kicked out of the union. The union shop is similar, but here it's a little better for workers. Like the employer can hire anybody, but then that worker is forced to join the union. So we still have union shops in some places, tend to be in the Midwest and in the Northeast, but this makes the union very strong because every worker is a part of it. So you can get a job in a particular field, but once you get the job, you have to join the union within a certain amount of time. These unions have the power to negotiate with management, and they're better off because all of the workers are involved. And this makes sure that the union will remain powerful over time because all of the new workers will be a part of the union. In response to union power, we have a lot of states passing what's called right-to-work laws. Right-to-work laws make the union shop illegal. It makes it so that no worker can ever be forced to join a union when they become a part of a workplace. So right-to-work laws make unions much, much weaker. They create free rider problems for unions. Unions end up losing membership because workers can free ride. All the workers are going to benefit from what the union does, so the workers don't want to join the union, pay the dues to the union if they're going to benefit for free anyway. Right to work laws tend to be passed in states that are controlled by Republicans. So we want to remember like interest groups, they can change their allegiance and everything, so it's not always true, but historically unions have tended to support Democrats. Business owners have tended to support Republicans. And so Republicans tend to be on the side of business owners against labor unions. And in this case, they're passing laws that make labor unions weaker. Here we can see a map of the places that pass right-to-work laws. The right-to-work laws are in the lighter blue, and the states that are in the darker blue are the states that allow businesses to operate union shops. So in those places, the states that are dark blue have very strong unions. The states that are light blue have weakening unions. They're weaker and they're getting weaker all the time. And when we look at the 2012 election map, those maps look almost identical. So you can see the states where there's a lot of Republican support are the states that end up passing right-to-work laws. The states where there is a lot of support for labor unions tend to be states where there's a lot more Democratic support. All right, so that's it about the types of interest groups, and a lot of focus on labor unions there at the end. But we want to make sure that we can categorize all the different types of interest groups that we're going to deal with. Now, we've been speaking about labor unions the last few minutes here. It looks like President Trump is having some problems with a labor union here. So, one of Trump's old casinos out there in Atlantic City looks like they're having to deal with a strike from the workers at the casino. Today, we want to make sure that we're able to explain how the free rider problem is a problem for interest groups. We want to explain that like people are going to benefit off the group and what the group does and all that kind of stuff. So the differences between the potential group and the actual group. We need to make sure that we can explain why big interest groups actually have difficulties in politics, like how it's harder to be a big interest group and how that's the kind of thing that's different than a political party. We want to make sure that we can compare the different types of interest groups. Think about policy groups. Think about the groups that advocate for the rights of a group of people. Think about all those different types of groups that we went through. And we want to make sure that we can describe examples of each of those. It's going to be really important that we're able to describe examples of interest groups in action. The last thing we want to do today is we want to make sure that we can describe the kinds of policies that impact labor unions. So we want to know the difference between the union shop and the right to work laws. We want to know why there are different, why political parties treat unions differently because of the history of political support. And that's it for the types of interest groups. We talked about a lot of different kinds of interest groups today. And so I think we know several examples of interest groups. And now we want to focus on how the interest groups get the job done. Like we want to find out what exactly the interest groups do to be able to influence policy and political officials.